Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers and certainly hope you're enjoying your weekend. Some of the quick fixes for Kentucky elections during the pandemic could now become permanent. Secretary of State Michael Adams will join us later to discuss what could change for the next round of elections. But first, this weekend wraps up Black History Month. We have presented several stories on WKYT during the month that highlight the contributions of African Americans in Kentucky. Now a discussion on where things are and where we go from here on issues of race relations and diversity. Joining us first is Dr. Dannie Moore. He's a vice president at Eastern Kentucky University and the school's diversity, equity, and inclusion officer. Dr. Moore, thank you very much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
How important is it, first off, in your view, that during Black History Month and at all times that we consider the key contributions of African Americans in Kentucky and beyond?
I think it's imperative. I think for so long, Black History Month has been kind of seen as an afterthought, or Black history in general has been seen as an afterthought. And I think it's important that we understand that Black history is American history. But I think for many of us, you know, I had a colleague that I was talking to recently, and when we think about what's taught in education, period, right, or in higher education, we think about a lot of folks can see their culture represented in the curriculum, in their day-to-day experiences, in what they're learning. And for a lot of Black folks, it's like their courses are taught as an elective. So I think it's imperative that we understand that Black history is American history, and as we think about, you know, people like myself, you know, I am a product of you know, what came before me, and my success wouldn't be what it is today if it wasn't for the people that paved the way for me. So I think it's important that we look at it as American history, and we understand the folks that came before us and really paved the way for African Americans to be successful in this community.
As we look at where things are now, you know, it was a dramatic year, certainly a struggle in this country with the COVID pandemic and the racial strife as well. But there were some interesting conversations that got going. Have the things that we have started talking about been fruitful in your view?
Definitely. I think we have started to acknowledge things like systematic racism are real. I think for so long the conversation is, you know, racism doesn't exist, or, you know, let's look at, you know, how we get past racism. I think right now the conversation shifts to anti-racism. The conversation shifts to organizations having these uncomfortable and difficult conversations. And I think that's where progress happens, when we're in a room or we're in spaces and we're talking about how we move forward, or how we eradicate racism, or how we look at our organizations, look at our policies and our practices, and look at it from a lens where racism does exist, and we have to move to a space where we're thinking about that and we're having those difficult conversations. So I think, though you talked about the things that have happened over the last 12 months, you know, it's been a difficult year, but I think again, if I had to see a bright spot, it's now we're able to have some of these tough conversations and move to a space of learning.
And you touched on how there are so many perspectives. You know, people of a certain age were taught that the goal in American society was to become post-racial, that to get to a point where race isn't a consideration in decisions about jobs and promotions. Then there's also the narrative, as you were saying, that society needs to be intentional in an ongoing way about engaging voices, providing everybody a seat at the table. How do you square those things?
Well, I think you kind of touched on that. I think it's about intentionality. I think, you know, I'm a parent. So as a parent, you know, I have conversations with my children all the time, but we have to talk about, for my daughter's lived experiences may be different than a lot of people. Like, so to say, you know, things that are post-racial it's not realistic for all people. So I think it's important that we intentionally have conversations to talk about how we move through it, how we navigate, how we do better. You know, I think, you know, I get a chance to work with some great colleagues, and we're able to have some of these tough conversations on how we move our organization forward. How are we intentionally making space? How we looking at not just the seat at the table, but our conversations, our policies, our practices. We need to be looking at that from a space to make sure they're equitable. You know, I think we for so long have looked at trying to make things equal. You know, everybody's the same, everything's equal. I think it's important that when we think about race relations, we're thinking about equity. We're thinking about making sure everybody that walks in our door has what they need to be successful. And I think it's about being intentional with it.
We have seen ample evidence that the COVID vaccination distribution has been inequitable. And trust is a big issue in that. How important is it that healthcare professionals recognize that there are legitimate questions to be answered, even if the science pretty clearly shows that the vaccine is safe?
Well, I think it's we have to think about the communities that are already disproportionately affected by so many different things. So I think it's hard to say, I have this vaccine and, I'm going to go, this is the end of COVID. But for certain communities, that's difficult. We first have to have conversations about why we lack trust or why there's inequities in the first place. So I think though I'm happy that we're trying to get the vaccine to as many people as possible, but I think we have to do a better job of some of those initial difficult conversations about how we got here. How do we get to this space where there's a lack of trust? We have to talk about history. We have to talk about how vaccines were tried on certain communities. So I think, and again, many healthcare workers are having those conversations, are understanding why communities feel this way, and then also understanding certain communities lack certain resources that are needed to be able to get to the vaccine or to understand. So I think having some conversations with some of those communities, engaging with communities, and not just looking at the end product, but some of that community building in the middle.
Dr. Moore, how deeply embedded within the racial equity question are the criminal justice issues that are being addressed now at some levels, at least are now a very serious conversation in the country?
Definitely. I think it's, again, talking about equity. I think the conversation is starting to move to a space where we're having difficult conversations around equity, and I think one thing that's exciting is a lot of these conversations are including, law enforcement. They're including policymakers or decision makers. So it's not just, the folks that are seeing the harm. I think that the people who have the opportunity to make some very important changes, they're engaging in spaces where we're having conversations. And as a higher education professional, students are challenging us to do better. They want these conversations. They want us to process. They want us to engage with them about how we can move things forward. So, I think it's exciting for me as an educator that, students are really pushing us to do better.
I think I hear you saying that if everybody is to be a stakeholder, then everybody needs to have a voice and a place at the table to be heard.
Definitely.
EKU is considered a school of opportunity. Do you find that in this racially, politically divisive time that it gets some things right when it comes to fostering some dialogue and thoughts about diversity and inclusion, and particularly considering your service area includes a lot of Appalachia and then into the Bluegrass region as well?
Definitely. I think, again, I've only been here since July, but I feel like we're a leader in this conversation. I think we, from the board to the president, we're talking about, the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, the importance that it has in our community, the importance that we're developing leaders that can lead in the global world. So I think, for me, this is exciting. We're building something great here, and we're building spaces to have difficult conversations, whether it's conversations with our incoming students, whether it's conversations with our faculty and staff. We're at a place where we understand as an institution, we have a responsibility to prepare our students to lead. And, from the president down, we are definitely doing that.
What are your goals at EKU moving forward, and how might you lead the conversation in the region and then determine in a few years what has been successful?
Definitely. I think for the Commonwealth, CP does a great job of starting that conversation for all institutions. We provide metrics, but I think for us, we're striving to be, our commitment, right? Like I think for a lot of folks, diversity, equity, inclusion is about compliance. We do it because we have to do it. Well, for us, it's commitment. We believe in what we're saying. We believe in what we're doing, and we want to be the best at it. I feel like, for students, this is a great place to come, learn, grow, develop, lead. And so what we're doing is we're creating opportunities for our students to come engage with difference. I think we all talk about being inclusive, but to be inclusive, we have to be okay with engaging with difference. We have to be okay with facilitating some of these difficult and uncomfortable conversations. And I think that's what we're doing here. We are doing what we have to do to make sure our students are ready to lead and grow and thrive. And it's exciting. I mean, I talk about being an educator. It is exciting as a parent to, work at an institution that, as a parent of a high school senior, she's excited to come here and to be a part of what we're doing here, because this is a great place.
As you look forward right now, I mean, do you think, you've been in this a while now, you were nearly 10 years at Northern Kentucky University and now at EKU, so you've had a good perspective on the Commonwealth. Is progress being made?
Oh, definitely. Now, again, I say definitely, but I say that we still have work to do. And I think, I had some conversations this week. As we make progress, we have to continue to be commitment, because it's easy to go backwards. So as we start to see, we've at EKU, we've been able to present data to show we're retaining more students. We're graduating more diverse students. So as we continue to make progress, we have to continue to show our commitment and do the good work. I mean, this is work that is ongoing, it's continuous. And as we continue to do that, we will continue to be successful. So we can't get complacent. We have to keep our commitment front and center and continue to move in that direction.
Dr. Dannie Moore, who is EKU's Vice President and the Chief Officer for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We really appreciate you being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And stay with us now. We'll be back with the Kentucky Secretary of State, Michael Adams, on some changes that may be coming the next time elections roll around. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers, and we're glad you're here. Will some of the election changes enacted under an emergency declaration over COVID now become permanent? Kentucky voters turned out in large numbers for last year's primary and general elections, and many indicated it was the greater flexibility in rules that gave them the opportunity to vote. Some others say the rules are the rules, and if you want to say, you need to show up and vote on Election Day. Secretary of State Michael Adams is the Secretary of the State of the Commonwealth. He is a Republican, and he is pushing hard for some reforms. And just as we actually delayed taping this interview, just as we're doing this, Mr. Secretary, you got some good news from the State House, right?
Yeah, it's been quite a 24 hours. Yesterday, our election reform bill, our easy to vote, hard to cheat bill, was heard in committee in the House. It passed unanimously, which we didn't really expect. And then within 24 hours, it was on the House floor, passing 93-4. It's really remarkable, the momentum that we've gotten behind this legislation, and I feel pretty good about its shot in the Senate as well.
Do you think the turnout last year and the response from voters shows that they want more options rather than having to show up during a 12-hour period on a weekday when it's a work day for most people?
There's no question about it, but clearly the way people wanted to vote last time was to vote in person, but to do so before Election Day. There's really no industry in America, no government function in America that's limited to one day and 12-hour span. Let's keep up with modern times. That's why we have a legislature meeting every year. Kentuckians really want to vote in person. Even in a pandemic, 70% of our voters in November voted in person, but most of them voted before Election Day. 45% of all the votes were cast in person, but before Election Day. That was the plurality way people voted. It's not feasible, it's not sustainable to have 2 and 3 week long elections, but having just a few days, including a Saturday, is a game changer in helping people vote, especially working people.
Let's talk about what this bill would change if it does make its way through both chambers.
Well, the key components are, number one, 3 days of early voting, no excuse required. You can vote on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday before Election Day, so you'll have 4 days to vote. We keep the vote center ability of the counties. We're not going to close all the precincts, but we're going to allow the counties to have centralized vote centers where you can vote regardless of your precinct. It's really convenient for most people. We keep the absentee ballot portal that allows us to track absentee ballots and see where they are in the system, allows the voters to have that transparency as well as the election officials. It keeps the cure process for voters whose signatures have changed since they registered to vote and they signed a card. And then they vote absentee 50 years later and their signature looks different. Now, instead of their votes just being thrown out, they're actually contacted so they can have a chance to prove their identity. Those are the things that we did by executive orders last year that were really popular, and we're trying to keep that. But we also have enhanced ability in this bill to allow me to take further action to get the voter rolls cleaned up.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that here in just a second. But, you know, what this does not include then is all kinds of early absentee voting, which was one thing that some people also said they liked, but there was also the criticism and the questions about security.
Well, I'll tell you, I've got no problem with absentee voting, mail-in voting with respect to security. We've made that totally airtight and secure. But the fact is, it's the most expensive way you can run an election. In a pandemic, we obviously had to have that as an option for people who had health conditions or because of their age were especially vulnerable. But that wasn't something that we were pushing on a permanent basis. That was for a pandemic. That wasn't a no excuse absentee. It was a pandemic excuse absentee. The rules that we're writing now are for a permanent use, and we just don't feel that that's the best way to run our elections.
You also support allowing election workers to work half a day. Is it more challenging all the time to get poll workers, period, and especially when you're asking that they show up for a more than 12-hour day, a training session before that? I mean, it's quite a commitment.
It is. I introduced through emergency powers last year reforms like that. That did not make it into the bill as it currently stands, and that's fine. I really wanted to give the clerks some more options in terms of recruiting poll workers, because the problem that we have recruiting poll workers is not a new problem. It's not even a COVID problem. It's a perpetual problem. It's something that older folks do, and then they age out and they're not being replaced by younger people. But I do think the vote center language in this bill will actually help a lot with enabling us to be able to carry off more in-person voting, but with not as many poll workers required.
There were some who have said there was massive fraud in the November election around the country, though there's been little evidence of that presented to the courts. Do you think that Kentucky's process went well?
I really couldn't be happier. And things. It's interesting. As recently as June, I was being called a vote suppressor by Hillary Clinton and other celebrities out of our state. And then we actually had the most successful election in America. We became a national model. And don't take that from me, take that from the Washington Post. We became a model that people look to. I'm really proud of that. It wasn't an accident. It's something that took a lot of work with the governor and Democrats and Republicans together across the state to pull off. Our county clerks really did a great job. And so that wasn't an accident. My goal now is to keep us from reverting to what we had for 200 years, which frankly was less secure a model for ballot integrity than what we had in 2020.
Yeah, and I don't want to totally dismiss the questions about security and the potential for fraud. You have purged a lot of people from the voting rolls early this year. How many dead people were still on Kentucky's voting list?
We think we're just about caught up with getting dead voters off the rolls. We've actually had several months I've been here in this office. We've taken more dead voters off the rolls and added live voters, which is pretty tough, especially in a presidential cycle with the type of interest you have from people registering to vote. But the next step is to take people off who have moved out of our state and registered to vote in some other state. Under our current law, even if I'm notified of that, I can't take those people off. I have to leave them on our rolls while they're still on some other rolls in some other state voting in the other state. So I've asked the legislature to close that loophole in our law and allow me to take those people off. That could be hundreds of thousands of voters.
While you're establishing yourself as a reformer in that office, we have a patchwork of election rules around the country, different states with different traditions. Some also have called over the years for an open primary. The fastest growing segment of party identification is independent, and you have to join a party and vote to vote in a primary in Kentucky, even though independents have to pay for the election, as every taxpayer does. Should independents have a say in primaries?
I don't have strong feelings about that either way, but I will tell you, I've never met a Democratic or Republican legislator who thinks that we should open the primary. The reason being, Democrats want to choose their own candidates and the Republicans want to choose their own candidates. And so until right now we have about 9% of our electorate are registered independent or other party. Unless that segment grows significantly, I don't really expect demand from the public in favor of open primaries.
But those people are paying for the election. right?
Sure. Yeah, and they can vote in the election. If it's a nonpartisan primary, they can vote in it.
As you look at the trend lines, and I know you've always been factual with us and not a partisan cheerleader, but the Republican registration is now getting very close to the Democratic registration, which was dominant even as a decade ago or so. Do you see those lines crossing within the next year or so?
Yeah, I can't give you a timeline, but I fully expect that during my term of office that the Republican Party will be the majority party by registration in Kentucky. I don't know this for certain, but I think that in 2019, that was the only election in state history that no Democrat was able to get a majority of votes for any office, not even Governor Beshear. That's pretty remarkable to me. I grew up in an 88% Democrat county, McCracken, that now is ruby red. So I've certainly lived through that change in my lifetime as well.
You may or may not have a position on this, although you are an election expert. That's what you did before you were Secretary of State. There's a proposal to change the way a Kentucky governor could fill an open U.S. Senate seat. It would force the governor to pick from a list provided by the party that held the seat. If a vacancy happened late enough, there could be a wide open election and then potentially a runoff. And that hasn't been part of the scene here in Kentucky. Are you supportive of that?
It's the kind of thing that our office stays neutral on. We'll leave that up to the legislature to make that sort of determination. To me, it's very clear under the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that it's solely in the province of the legislature to decide how a term, a vacancy is filled in the U.S. Senate. The Constitution is very clear about that, and of course, we'll defer to the legislature.
There's also a bill that would make Louisville's elections nonpartisan, as most city offices are across Kentucky. But partisan races are the tradition there, and most localities get to make the decision for themselves. Do you take a position on how that should go, whether that is a local decision or something for Frankfort to decide for Louisville?
I don't really have a position because it's not a state election or a federal election. All those local elections are run by the county clerks, and so I'll leave it up to the county clerk in Jefferson County. 2021
is an off year for elections here in Kentucky. There wouldn't be any unless there are some.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, right. We get that every 5 years. I guess it's once every 4, right, within the 4-year cycle. No constitutional amendments can be on the ballot this year, but when will things begin setting up for the 2022 cycle? When can people start to file? That will include the U.S. Senate race, congressional, legislative, and a lot of local contests next year.
Well, I saw that Senator Rand Paul just announced he plans to run for another term and is going to file with our office, obviously, to do that. By law, we're not able to open up candidate filing until November. So I believe it's November 3rd. I think starting November 3rd, we'll have actually quite a crowd of candidates for all sorts of offices beginning to come back into the Capitol and filing. I look forward to that. I really enjoy that part of this job, is meeting all the candidates and stamping their papers.
As candidates make their plans about next year, what would you remind them to think about as they do get ready to get those papers together? Sometimes there's confusion. Do you file in Frankfort or can you file back home, for instance?
Well, the big thing that's going to lead to potential confusion is what the lines are going to be. We're at that point, the decennial redrawing of the lines for county offices, for state offices, for federal offices. That happens. Usually it would happen in this year, in this session. Right now they can't do that because they don't have census data yet. That's been delayed from Washington. So we're expecting to get that information this summer or fall. And then there'll either be a special session, presumably, to draw those lines, or they'll take it up at the beginning of the next session in January.
You believe the 2022 elections will be run with new district lines?
Yeah, I'm very, very confident of that. I think it'll likelier happen that you'll see the filing deadline being delayed from January to maybe even April, so that we can have a session, we can pass new lines into session, and then put people on notice what the lines are and what districts they live in. They can't make those decisions about what to run for if they're not sure what district they're in.
Secretary of State Michael Adams, thank you for joining us. Congratulations on getting your bill as far as you have, and we'll follow. Thank you.
Thanks.
Stay with us. We'll be back on Kentucky Newsmakers in a moment. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers, and some Kentuckians took part in the trials. An FDA advisory committee is reviewing Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine candidate. Our chief national political analyst Greta Van Susteren has details.
Hello, I'm Greta Van Susteren, and here is your Full Court Fast Break. The nation could be days away from rolling out a third COVID-19 vaccine. Data shows Johnson & Johnson's vaccine with the current COVID strains in the U.S. has an overall efficacy rate of 72%. That is notably lower than Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines, but it is the first single-dose shot to prevent COVID infection. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine can also be refrigerated for at least 3 months. This could simplify distribution efforts still lagging from logistical hurdles. Johnson & Johnson plans to have 20 million doses ready by the end of March. Pfizer and Moderna are pledging a combined 220 million doses by the end of March. And so far, roughly 50 million Americans have received one or both COVID doses. Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, says the CDC could soon release new guidance for vaccinated people. He expects those new guidelines to relax safety regulations for people who have been fully vaccinated. Want more Full Court Press? Tune in Sunday. We bring politics home, covering the national stories that impact you.
And remember that you can watch Full Court Press with Greta Van Susteren this morning at 11:30 on WKYT. And that's Kentucky Newsmakers. We'll see you bright and early this week on WKYT this morning. I'm actually going to take a couple of days off. I'll join the crowd on Wednesday, but the rest of our morning team will be here. And we certainly hope you make it a good week ahead.